Hello, greetings, and welcome to part 2 of our Join Your ERP and Microsoft Teams at the Hip technical deep dive. My name is Peter Carson. I'm going to be your host for the next hour or so. Hopefully you joined for last week's session. If not, we do have the recording available for it. It's more of a business focused, what was the problem we were trying to solve. Today's session is going to be more technical under the hood. What's the nitty gritty around the solution itself. A little background on myself, if you haven't joined one of my webinars before, I'm the president of Extranet User Manager, also Envision IT, the parent company, and an Office Apps and Services Microsoft MVP. Contact information is all up on the slide here. We're recording the session. Sorry, not a good sign. I'm losing my voice already. And going to be providing the deck after the fact as well. Okay. Quick background on Extranet User Manager. Part of Envision IT. It's a bespoke solution that we built for a number of our clients over the years, and then over the last 6-7 years, I guess now we've kind of turned it into its own ISV product. And more recently, version 4, version 5 imminently coming out around the product. Really around managing external folks, not the topic for today's conversation, but one of the sister products, which is our open source Teams provisioning, is going to be the context for today's talk. Okay, so in terms of what we're going to be going through, we've covered introductions. We're going to do a very brief recap from last week's session, and then we're going to dive right under the hood and into the technical bits from there. Now, if I lose you in certain parts here, hang in there. There's nuggets that you can use, even if you're not going to leverage all the pieces that are in here. We're going to start with the SharePoint Framework Web Parts, so the pieces that the end user sees on your SharePoint pages to say, hey, I'd like a new team, or I'd like to discover an existing team, and the logic app workflows that sit behind that to drive those processes around that. Then we'll get a little deeper down into the Azure Automation, the PowerShell, and the PNP, which is really where the heavy lifting happens in terms of setting up a new team, SharePoint site, applying templates, setting up tabs, and things like that. We'll talk about some security best practices. That's been a big focus of the current iteration that we're working through right now, and wrap up with what are called ARM templates. ARM stands for Azure Resource Manager. It's a way of packaging up solutions that are going to get deployed to Azure that work very well from that point of view. So we're just getting the finishing touches on the ARM template for this solution, and I'll also talk about Azure DevOps, which is a way to manage your source control and continuous integration, some best practices from that point of view. We'll wrap it up from there. The Q&A is open, so if you've got questions, feel free to post them in there. I'll do my best to have a look. I've got folks on the line, Logan, Eric, Amanda, that'll be watching that. They'll do their best to answer questions or flag them to me if I need to respond at that particular point in time. If we've got a few minutes at the end, I will certainly circle back and cover those as well. So the first thing I'd like to do is actually do a quick poll. There's a couple ways you can do it. You can put the bit.ly link in. The way I like is I actually use my phone. So let me see if I can get this working here. So I want to do a little screen mirror to my local screen so you can see what I'm doing on my device here. There we go. So let me pull that across onto the other screen here. So what I've done is just airplayed my phone to my computer here so you can see what's going on. Basically what you want to do if you haven't used QR codes before is just pick your camera app. You're not actually taking a picture. You're just pointing the camera at the QR code on the screen. You'll see at the top of my screen there it says open in Chrome. I can just go ahead and click that and boom, I'm into the survey. So while you're listening to me talk, you can actually be going through the survey on your phone and fill out the details in there. The key piece that I'm keen to see some feedback on is just background of the audience, who's done what from some of the different topics that we're going to be talking about. Have you done something with Teams provisioning? Are you familiar with SharePoint Framework? And it's totally cool to say, hey, I'm not sure what this even is, or I'm interested in it, I'm doing some investigation in it, or I'm actively using it. And it kind of goes down through the different technology stack through there. So I'll come back to this in a minute. Once we've got some responses in there, we'll have a look at what people have put in from that point of view and use that to guide what we want to dive maybe a little deeper into versus less deep. Okay. So quick recap while you're filling that out. This is from last or 2 weeks ago session. This obviously COVID has had a huge impact on everybody around the world, and remote working, particularly around the knowledge workspace, has just exploded. And with that has the adoption of Teams. And for a lot of organizations, that meant just open it up, let it loose, and we just got to start dealing with the fact that all of our staff are remote. So it's been pretty unplanned, and there's not a lot of consistency between different teams and SharePoint sites and how that's hanging together. What this solution is about is self-service, saying, hey, let's provide a way for people to be able to request a team, request a SharePoint site, and have some consistency. It's not about having rigid rules. People don't like that, but allow sort of a starting point. If you give everybody a blank slate, you're going to end up with an infinite number of different variations of that. If you give people a good starting point that's got some structure to it, they generally stay within the boundaries of that, and you get a lot of consistency within your organization. So it's a nice balance to have from that point of view. So if you did miss part one, I encourage you to go up to our events section on our website. The link is there. If you scroll down under the recent events, you'll see it. We have both the deck and the recording for that session in there. And really, we're going to dive into the open source solution side of it here. There are third-party solutions as well. Orchestry is an organization that we partner with quite often. They've got a really nice, slick commercial solutions. Check that out too. Some of the gaps that we see that Orchestry is still working on, they've done a fantastic job of the self-service user experience side of it. A lot of our clients like to see deeper integrations into back-end systems, which is kind of the intent of this talk here. And that's where we're able to go deeper on this side. I know Michael Pasaric very well. He's a former Microsoft MVP as well, out in Vancouver. And he and I have had lots of chats around where he's going with his product and providing APIs and that sort of integration type of stuff that we'd like to do. So I'm keen to see where he goes with the product and how we build more integrations in on that side as well. So, what are the business requirements of what we're trying to achieve here? Well, we need some sort of self-service form for end users to be able to say, hey, I'd like a team, I'd like a SharePoint site, it's for this particular purpose, so let me pick a template, and maybe there's some approvals around there or not, depends on your organization, or even, who the person is within your organization that's making that request. We want to make it very extensible and customizable. Everybody's a little bit different, the things that they want to capture, how they want to set up their templates, to make sure it works well from that point of view. And as much as possible, we want to leverage out of the box, but allow customized site templates as part of that. We want to support all the modern stuff, so modern team sites, communication sites, 365 groups, Microsoft Teams, and we really wanted to make it not a no-code solution. There is a fair bit of PowerShell involved in it, but not a Visual Studio hardcore developer type of solution. Wanted to make it straightforward from that point of view. Something that IT pros can really get their heads around. And it depends how deep you want to go. We do open source the whole solution. I'll show you what we've got on that side, and you can go sort of deeper or higher depending on how much customization you want to do as part of that. Okay. So I just want to have a look at what we've got here on a poll result. We've got a number of results coming in already here. So let me pull that across. So kind of a spread, between actively using to not even sure what this is. So, we'll try and cover all things across there. Things like service principles, that's a pretty technical term. We're going to get into more detail of what that means as we get down through there. But nice to see, most of these have an actively using as part of the audience through here. So a pretty good spectrum from that perspective. And if you haven't had a chance to fully fill that out, please continue with that. I'd love to get the feedback and just get a sense of how people are doing some of these different things as part of this. So in terms of the supporting technologies, the poll covered on a number of those, and these icons, this icon here represents Azure Logic Apps, so that's the workflow behind the process that we're going to be going into. SharePoint is a big part of the solution. It's not just about provisioning SharePoint sites, it's actually using SharePoint as the tool to store the requests and the lifecycle and all the information related to that. And PowerShell is a big piece of it as well. I mentioned a lot of the heavy lifting happens through PowerShell. And we use a lot of commandlets from Microsoft's PNP, which is their patterns and practices, open source initiative around provisioning. So a lot of leverage from that point of view. So one of the first things I just want to cover, I went over this in the previous webinar as well, is that when you request a team, whether you go through a provisioning process or a request process that you've built, or you just let people say create team right through the Teams interface, there's a bunch of stuff that you're going to get as part of that. You're going to get a Microsoft 365 group, a SharePoint Online modern team site. You'll get a OneNote notebook inside of that team site. You may get a planner plan. This stuff here, the stream from a recording point of view is starting to change. Microsoft's going in a direction where they're not putting Teams recordings into stream. They're actually putting them into SharePoint Online. I like where they're going with that. It's a nice concept. So some tweaks coming along, and that's part of what you need to think about as you're building these processes out, is recognizing that the landscape is always changing. Microsoft 365 is evolving very quickly, and make sure you build things in a way that adapts to that change and helps your organization adapt to those changes as well. So this is the actual request form, and I'm going to show you the live version of this form in a minute and get under the hood as to how this is built. So this is a SharePoint framework web part that you deploy to your tenant. Basically asks the user a bunch of questions, and you can configure which of these questions you want turned on or off, how complex you want this form to be. And it's got a concept of different templates and different divisions, and fair bit of flexibility even without cracking the code open. We actually have the ability to dynamically generate fields on the form based on content types in SharePoint. So this is probably a good point to flip over to the live demo side. So let me come here to our Envision IT Dev Tenant. So this is not our live tenant, it's our development one where we're working on the solution. It's kind of got the latest version of it in there. And this is that request web part that I was just talking about. We'll come to these other two in a minute. So I've got a number of divisions here, so you can organize sites under divisions, and those divisions could have hub sites associated with them. We leverage that a lot in our own usage in our Envision IT tenant, and that's all driven from a SharePoint list. So if I come into this list here, I can see the names of the divisions. There may or may not be approvers associated with that. There might be prefixes that we want to auto-populate onto the titles of the teams and the sites. And what's the parent URL of that division, and is that a hub site? So we may want to add requested sites automatically to a hub as part of this process. So you basically set that up in the divisions list. Once I pick a division, I'm going to just use this temporary demos one here. We'll see that we've got a site template, and there's yet another list for that. So if I look at the site templates list, it defines, what are the names of the different templates that we have, what's the description around it, and which divisions does it apply to. So you've got a mapping to say, hey, we've got a set of templates, we've got a set of divisions, and there's sort of a many-to-many relationship between those. So I've picked the temporary demos division, so all of the ones that are tagged with that as a division then show up in my list here. Now, I know this is about Teams provisioning. I'm not going to choose the modern team site that builds a team behind that. The only reason is that the actual provisioning process from Microsoft takes quite some time. If you've gone through the out of the box, you'll see they've got big warnings in there saying, it may take up to 24 hours. Generally, we see it sort of in an hour and a half time, obviously longer than we have for a webinar. A modern communication site is just a standalone SharePoint site. They get spun up in a number of seconds, so they're actually a really good one to use from a demo point of view. And you can see I did a dry run webinar 1 here. So if I was to use that same name, one of the things we do in the web part is to actually do a live checkout to say, hey, does that exist or not? Okay, you can't actually use that URL. So let's change that to webinar 2. Okay, we're good to go from there. And you can see that based on the division I picked, it's putting an auto prefix in there. It's setting up a particular URL structure to that as well. So you've got some rules that you can define. You don't have to use that, but you definitely can. Now, one of the things we really like in our solution, shameless plug here, is we do a lot around the external sharing side of things. So being able to define the sharing rules as part of the template, and you can bake it so that these aren't available to choose from. Maybe it's based on the division, maybe it's based on the template, that you can or can't do different styles of sharing. So you can still lock it down and provide some controls around that. And maybe you want your approval process to say, hey, if the requested site or team is being shared with external users, that needs a different level of approval than just a regular team site that can just go straight through with no approvals. So because it's all in Logic Apps, I'll show you in a minute, you can really customize what that approval workflow looks like. So let's just go ahead and submit this. So what this is doing is it's submitting it to a sites list. So it's just writing it to a SharePoint list. That's all the SharePoint Framework Web Part does. So if I look at this sites list here, we'll see here's my demo webinar 2 that I just created, and it's partially filled out. Like it doesn't have a parent URL on there, it doesn't have a site created yet because it actually hasn't been spun up yet. But what's happening in the background is there's a logic app workflow that triggers off of this list. So if I look at the runs history for this particular workflow, let me just refresh that. It will fire off in a couple minutes. I'm actually going to kick the tires and say, you know what, just go ahead and check for that new item. So when I refresh it now, we'll see that there's a running workflow through here. It's still going to take a minute or two. The test I did as a dry run took 2 minutes to run through. So why don't we take 2 minutes now and just have a look at how that workflow hangs together, and then we'll look at the results from there. So if you're familiar with Power Automate and not familiar with Logic Apps, don't worry, because they are actually the same platform under the hood. Logic Apps is actually the underlying technology that Power Automate sits on top of. Power Automate has some additional features around things like a more sophisticated approval process than what Logic Apps has. There's a few other things in there that are unique to Power Automate, but for the most part, like all the connectors and actions and all that richness that you have in Power Automate, you have the same thing here in Logic Apps. So we can see this particular Logic App triggers off when a new item is created. So it's looking at a particular site and list and saying, hey, when something shows up in that sites list that I was just showing you, start running this workflow. And initialize a bunch of variables, come down in here, maybe that entry got set up in the list for an existing site that doesn't need to be created. So check to make sure if it's empty or not. If it is empty, then let's go have a look at the actual divisions list, because we want to make a decision and figure out whether we need to do approvals or not. So it's basically coming in here and saying, hey, is the approver field filled in for this particular request that came through? And if so, I want to start an approval email process. And this is where the power of Logic Apps starts to come in. You can start to build these complex processes in here. You can build out the email that goes across. You can do email substitutions into that, and it'll basically send to whoever the approver list is, which was defined back in those SharePoint lists. So it's very flexible. A notification saying, hey, a request just came through. You need to either approve or reject it. Now, if there is no approver, just go ahead and set the approval to approved so it can continue on from there. And down here, we capture the results that comes out of this approval step. So ultimately, we can say, hey, was this approved or not? If it wasn't approved, send the person that made the request a rejection email. Otherwise, call out to Azure Automation. And this is where the PowerShell and the heavy lifting happens. I'll show you this in a minute to actually go create the site, get the results from that, and then determine, hey, did that work properly? Was the site successfully created? If not, send some an error notification. Otherwise, send the person that requested it an email saying, hey, your request is approved, your site is ready to go. So let's actually go back here and refresh. And oh, that's still running. Okay, so it might take a minute longer. What I can do is I can look at the dry one that's in there. Let me just refresh this page. Yeah, so we don't see it showing up just in here yet because it's not created. But basically what we'll see is on these A to Z web parts that show me sites and teams that exist, links to get across to them. So it becomes an easy way to navigate across and find those. I have the ability to organize it by letter through here. And basically this one down here is saying, okay, any requests that came through this temporary demos division, show them in here. So I can easily see them from that point of view. I'm impatient. Let me go back here and see. Ah, there we go. It succeeded. Okay. So you can actually live as this is running. I suppose I could have opened it while it was still running, see the progress, and these check marks change from empty to orange in progress to red if there's an error, to green if it's completed okay. So you can actually see the path that the workflow took. It basically came in here and said, hey, I'm going to check to see if there was an approver. Remember, I picked the temporary without approver, so it went right through the no approver required step and skipped that. Came down in here and said, okay, I'm going to call out to Azure Automation, and that's the one that takes the most time. It took 3 minutes to actually run that PowerShell, and then checks to see how that worked. Everything looks great. Send an email out saying it's good to go. So if I look at my Outlook in this tenant, oops, sorry, I clicked on the wrong thing there. There's my approval through there. Actually, this email I need to tweak and update. We've got a better body that we usually use in here that actually gives you a link to the site itself. So if I come back over here, give a refresh on this page, there's our demo webinar 2 that just got created. So let's actually have a look at that site. So as I mentioned, this is a communication site. We didn't apply a template to this other than what we need to do to track the process. So it's pretty much an out-of-the-box modern communication site. You know, it's got all the standard web parts and things that come out of the box from Microsoft as part of that. But if I come down into the site contents, there is one little trick that we do here. We create this site metadata list in every site that we create, and we drop some metadata in here because it's difficult to do a search of sites. You can search the content that's in sites, but not the site itself. So we put this list in here to be able to do that kind of search. So it's got all the details of, you know, what division was this in, what's its URL, what's its purpose and alias, you know, all that kind of information is tracked in this sites list. And what we do is we use it up here in these web parts. So when I look at this top web part and it's got this My Sites list in here, actually if I go to the D for the demos, no, I haven't seen the other one show up yet either. The way this works is what it's doing is it's doing a SharePoint search saying, find me those little snippets of site metadata on all the sites that you have access to. So if I'm not a member of this site and I'm not able to see this site, search is not going to return this result, and it's not going to show up as one of my sites. But independent of this process, all I need to do is add somebody to this site so they have access to the site as a whole. Search will pick that up and it will start showing up in their My Sites. So it's a nice way to track which sites a person has access to. And it's this concept of private versus public versus hidden sites that we have in what we've done. We sort of extended the Microsoft model. So when I make a site request in here and I pick a particular template, I don't think I have it on that one. Let me try the demo fields. Yeah, we've got a site visibility here, a public, private, or hidden. Public, everybody in the organization just has access to, so it would automatically show in the My Sites for everybody. Private means you need to be added to the team or added to the site to have visibility to it. But in our concept, a private site is still visible to other people in the organization. So what that means is it would show up in the available sites to say, hey, this is a site that you don't have access to, but it's in the list, so you could request to have access to it. Versus a hidden site, which is kind of a super secret one. You know, that's you know your management planning site or something that's super private that you don't want to even share the existence of the site. It wouldn't show in this web part at all unless you were a member of that site. And then the all sites kind of matches that together to say, hey, here's the sites that you're both a member of and you could have access to. Or actually, we're starting to see the webinar 1, webinar 2 show up through there. So this web part here is basically doing a query against that sites list to say, hey, what sites fall into which of those buckets? And if that sites list is trimmed to say, hey, this particular item is hidden, we use permissions on the list to hide that item unless you're a member of it, then you don't see it in here whatsoever. So in terms of the web parts themselves, let's actually take a little deeper tour into the underhood. So we're going to go into the SharePoint Framework web parts themselves. So I can click on a web part, click on the pencil, and bring up all the configuration options available for that. And we've decided these options. So when we built this SPFX web part, you know, we decided what things we wanted to put over in the panel over here. So, you know, what title do you want to have up at the top? Where's the master list that it needs to connect to? What's the name of that list, the divisions list? So there's some flexibility if you wanted to call these things different things in your implementation, you could. Yeah, I'd kind of encourage you to stick with what we've done here. It's safer that way, but if there's a reason to do it, we've kept it fairly flexible from that point of view. I didn't talk about it, but we've got a blacklisted words list in here as well. So this defines things that you don't want people to use, like you don't want somebody who's not HR to create a team called HR. That would be bad. So let's put that on a blacklist. So you can define things that you don't want teams created for. You know, what labels do we want to have actually on the form? Maybe we don't want to call that division. Maybe we want to call it something different because it represents something different in your organization. So a lot of the labels you can define. You can even put a pre-selected division in there. So maybe you don't want people to pick that. You can have this web part in places, different places in your site. So maybe it's in a hub site and you want all requests to go to that hub site and be pre-selected with that division, for example. Same thing with the site template. Maybe you don't want to provide a choice for a template for this particular instance of the web part. You just want it pre-baked to a particular template. Now there's some API stuff here that we're deprecating. We're moving away from that. I'll come back to that in a minute. So that's what you can do here. Now the other thing that you can do, which is quite interesting. So let me just discard these changes here. So I briefly went into temporary demos and the demo fields template. And we'll see we've got a whole bunch of fields in here, like demo currency, date, lookup. The reason we have these is just to demonstrate different field types. Like this one will only take a dollar field. This one it provides a date picker. This has a lookup. So you can start doing, oh, I don't seem to have that one wired up properly, but you should be able to load a lookup list. So yes, no, a people finder. So there's myself in there. You know, a hyperlink, a multi-line field, a choice field. So there's lots of different types of fields you can have in SharePoint. And the way you drive how this form works is actually kind of cool. It's done through content types. So if I go into my site information and all site settings, and I look at the site content types. So if you're not familiar with content types and site columns in SharePoint, it's a way to define metadata independent of a list or a library that they're applying to. You can then use those content types in a lot of different places. And what we do is we ship the solution with a base site request content type that's got the main things that you need to get the form going. But you can extend that. So when you're having somebody fill out a request form for a new team, maybe there's some other additional pieces of information. Maybe there's a project code that's back in your ERP system, or some other lookup or connection that you want to put in through there. So you can see we've got this demo site request that's based off of the base site request. So the way content types work is they're hierarchical. So, you know, it'll inherit all of the columns from the base site request, but then it adds in all of these demo fields. And just by nature of me putting these content or site columns in here, you know, I can add in new site columns or existing site columns into here. They magically show up on the web part. That's part of the magic of what we've built in the SharePoint Framework web part, is it actually goes through that content type and says, hey, you know, you've picked this template that has this associated content type with it. Therefore, I'm going to put all of these fields up on the form here. You don't have to become a SharePoint Framework developer to change the fields. You just add them to the content type and they magically show in the web part. And then they get written into the sites list as part of that as well. I just realized I should probably turn my camera off so you can see the whole screen better. Apologies on that. Okay. So the other two web parts, let's have a look at those. They're actually the same web part. So if I edit this page again, and I look at the top sites list web part and edit that. So again, we've got a bunch of configuration option that we've done here. You know, where is it pointing to? So the same sort of configuration back to the lists that are in the site to wire it up. We've got different display mode, like this is showing an A to Z for both of these with tabs. I can have a straight list, I could have tiles. I could do an auto that says, hey, if there's less than a certain number, display it this way, otherwise change it to this way. So there's a fair bit of flexibility in terms of how you display that, how we group it, what are the lookups from there, and what do we want to call these different tabs. So again, you may have language differences or terminology difference you want to use as part of that. You can set that up through there. There's actually a page 2, so you have to hit the next here to get in, and you can define what are some of the other parameters. Do we want the My Sites option, yes or no, the available or the all sites, Or if we look down here in this one, we've only turned on the all sites option. We want to show all temporary demo sites, regardless of whether you have access to them or not. And there's some technical stuff around wiring up the search that I was talking about before, of how that search query works and its managed properties. So that's part of the deployment process to set up the search side. And the white paper talks about how you do those details. And again, the API stuff we're going to be deprecating. I suppose I should deal with that. I mean, the intent of the API was that when you use the web part as I've described it here, and it writes to the SharePoint list, it means that everybody that makes a request has direct contribute access to the sites list. And that's probably not a good idea. I mean, there's a lot of sort of technical hanging together the solution in this list, and you probably don't want people to be able to come in and edit grid view and just start messing with that and screwing up your whole implementation. The original way we had around that was we said, okay, let's give everybody read-only access, and let's have an API in between that does those updates. Deploying that API is a challenge. You need to deploy it as an Azure function, and there's a bunch more technical work to get it going. We found that a barrier to deployment and decided, you know what, more recently we've been doing a lot of work where forms just submit straight to a logic app. So instead of having the logic app trigger off of an item being created, we actually make this an HTTP post endpoint, and the web part can basically post its form data directly to the logic app. And instead of the logic app reading from the SharePoint list, it turns it on its head. And the logic app writes the data to the SharePoint list, and it does so with a credential that's set up in the logic app that's not the person that's signed in. So the person that signed in doesn't need to have contribute access to the list. It's a much more secure way of designing the application. So we're still in flight on that piece. That's one of the last pieces we're just wrapping up right now. You can use the solution as it is, writing directly to the sites list. I'd encourage to hold and let us get that last piece done. We're sort of a week or two away from getting the whole package wrapped up from that point of view. So that's on the logic app and the SharePoint framework web part. And come back to my deck. So I went pretty long on that, but there's a fair bit of bits under the hood hanging that all together. We talked about the logic app side of things. Let's move over to the Azure Automation. So I said that was the heavy lifting. If you remember the logic app flow, there was a 3-minute chunk saying go create this communication site. That was all happening in Azure Automation. So let's actually have a look at our Azure Portal again. So if I come out, what we've done is we've put all of the components to the solution in a single resource group. It keeps it together, which is nice from a deployment point of view. It lets you see all the pieces that are related to the solution. So we were just looking at the create site logic app, which is obviously a big part of it. It actually uses these 3 API connections in here to connect up to the various different things. So when it needs to fire off that Azure Automation job, it uses this connection. When it needs to send an email like an approval or a success, it uses the Office 365 connection. When it needs to talk to the SharePoint list, it uses the SharePoint Online connection. And each of those has their own identity, so I can come in here, edit the API connection, go through an authorization, and put credentials in as part of this. Right now, I've used my own credentials in there. You may want to create a separate service account, because things like the emails getting sent will literally be sent by the user that's authorized that. So if I use my account and I authorize this Office 365 connection, when this sends emails and I go to my regular Outlook, I'll actually see them in the sent items because it's literally being sent as that person that's authorized the connection. So just be aware of that as part of that. But what we want to get into now is the Azure Automation side. So that's this automation account, which also includes these runbooks. There are components of that as well that we'll talk about in a sec. So the automation account, it's basically a serverless way to run scripts. So if you've got PowerShell that you want to run, yeah, you could spin up a virtual machine and a task scheduler or something like that to run those scripts for you, but you'd have to maintain that environment and patch that server and do all sorts of work. Azure Automation drastically simplifies that and says, you know what, Microsoft has a pool of servers and it'll just grab one from the available pool, run your PowerShell script, configure it as it needs to be, and then dispose of it when it's done. And you basically use the usage, which is super cheap. We're talking 2.2 cents per minute USD after you've used up your 500 minutes. So this run took 3 minutes. So it would have used less than half a penny in consumption to run that particular run. So it's, extremely cost effective from that point of view. And I should mention the logic apps are similar. They're in tenths of a millionth of a cent per actions that get executed. So this whole solution is going to consume, at best maybe dollars a month, but quite often significantly less than that, depending on how many requests you're processing through as part of that. But let's dive into the automation account. So there's a number of things in here. I mean, the meat of it is the runbooks. So these are the actual PowerShell scripts. So if you remember, the logic app was calling a create site runbook to actually provision that request, and that's this runbook here. And I can actually edit right in the portal here. It's not how I typically work. I'm actually going to go into the view mode here, and I can see the actual PowerShell that's authored to do this. The way I typically work is I work on my local system. So if you're not familiar with PowerShell ISE, I'd encourage you to check it out. It's a super easy way to develop your script. So if I look at the create site script in here, I can edit my script. I've got all my IntelliHelp and color highlighting and PowerShell assistance through there. But more importantly, I can actually run it, and I can put a line in here and hit F9 on my keyboard because I'm a keyboard junkie and say, hey, I want to set a breakpoint on that line and start stepping line by line through the code. So it's a really easy way to both develop your code and to debug your code as you're working through here. And you'll see here, it's going out and getting an automation variable from Azure Automation, and it's using that to figure out, hey, am I running in Azure Automation or am I running in a local environment? So if I'm running in Azure Automation, I need to do a certain number of things through here. If I'm running locally, I'm going to do things a little bit differently, but for the most part, we've kept the code 100% the same between the two environments. And that was the goal, is to say, we don't want completely different code paths, because the whole point of debugging locally is to be debugging the same code that's going to run up in Azure Automation. Because while you can see the output of your job in Azure Automation, you can't set breakpoints, you can't inspect variables midstream through there. It's a lot tougher to do that sort of analysis. So basically what this script is doing is saying, hey, go hit that SharePoint list, so that sites list that I was showing you before, find anything that their site created is null, and get that list back for me. This is using what's called camel queries, which are a way to query not just through PowerShell, but through code against SharePoint. And ultimately it's getting a collection of sites or requests that it needs to provision, and it goes through each of those from there. And most of the heavy lifting is actually in a helper module, so it calls out to this provision site helper script to actually do the work. But then it also calls out to this create site customizations. One of the things that we wanted to do as a goal was to separate implementation specific code from the core solution itself. So, we encourage anybody that uses this solution not to touch things that are in the provision site unless something's clearly broken, and absolutely do a pull request back into Git to say, hey, I just fixed something in your code. But if there's something unique about the way you're implementing and how you want to do things, keep that in the customizations, so that a few months from now we've got an updated version of this. You can drop our main helper module on. You don't lose any of your customizations because they're all in a separate file from that point of view. So the helper function itself, if we come down, I think it's buried a fair ways down in through here. There's our provision site. So there's all sorts of functions in here that do different things, like this helper connect to PNP Online. This is how the authentication happens. We're going to talk more about that in a second. So if we come back to our Azure Portal, so we've got a number of runbooks that are in this automation account. We've got the create site. The helper is deployed as its own runbook in there. All your customizations are in this one here. This is another runbook that periodically goes through and says, hey, were there sites created or deleted outside of this process that I should know about? And it'll go update that sites list and keep it in sync from that point of view. So this is a good one to actually set up on a scheduled basis. Some of the other things that are in the automation account that are of interest, though, we've got the modules. So things like the patterns and practices modules that we're using, they get loaded up through here. So we actually have a gallery. I can actually search for PNP in here, and you'll see there's actually quite a few different PNPs. The PNP PowerShell, this is the new .NET Core one that they're moving everybody towards. So most of these other ones, like the SharePoint PNP PowerShell Online, that's what we used to use. It's now deprecated. You should really be moving all your code to this one here. And the current release that we're just putting out for the team's provisioning moves all the code to this new module from that point of view. Some of the other interesting things in here, we used to use the credentials. We've actually taken those out because part of that PNP change that Microsoft did was driving away from using user principal identities and moving that to service principal. So I'll talk in a minute as to what those are. We've also got variables, which are a good way to keep track of same sort of thing we saw in the SharePoint Framework Web Part configuration. You know, what are the important pieces that I need to know about this particular implementation, so I don't have to change the code. You know, the code can use all these variables, and then the implementation can set these specific to the environment, and your runbooks stay exactly the same. So that's a really good coding practice. We're going to talk about the same thing on the logic apps as well. All right, so let's come back over here. So I've gone through the resource group. You know, the documentation I need to update. So the V3 GitHub is the previous version. I actually haven't deployed the recent code. We're still wrapping the last pieces on that. It was literally about 1:30 in the morning last night when myself and another MVP that's been helping me out, Jack Lee, on this has been getting some of the last details through there. So we will have an updated tree there, and we're going to have a completely revamped white paper because we're significantly streamlining the whole deployment process as part of this as well. So look for that in the next week or two. We've already gone into a lot of the technical deep dives, so let me skip ahead through here. We did the workflow, Azure Automation, the PNP, make sure you're using the latest from that point of view. So let's get into the security best practices. So that web part, let's start at the top end there. So if I'm back on my home and I've got my Teams request web part. So let's say we've now moved to the secure model, and this web part is posting that to the logic app. So it doesn't go straight to the sites list, it goes to the logic app, and then the logic app securely uses its own identity to update the sites list. Well, how do we make that connection between the SharePoint Framework Web Part and the logic app? And that all needs to be done with Azure AD security. So I'm logged in as a user here who has an Azure AD identity in 365. And when I do things with this web part, it's in the context of that identity. So what we can do in the JavaScript, and SharePoint Framework supports this model fairly easily, is get what's called a bearer token. So we can go ask Azure AD to say, hey, I'm signed in as Peter Carson. Can you give me a bearer token that represents me from an identity point of view? And when I post this form through the script to that backend logic app, it's going to post that bearer token as part of that. And then the Azure logic app receives that bearer token, talks to Azure AD and says, is this a valid token? Did you give this to somebody? Because there's private and public keys that are part of that conversation. It can validate that token and say, yes, that is Peter Carson that's submitting to you. And then you can make decisions in the workflow from there. So rather than depending on the framework web part to post things like who's posting this, which isn't really a trusted way of doing it. You know, somebody could go into developer toolbar, hack the system, and fake it out and post directly to the logic app as somebody else. We want to make sure that we close that holes from a security point of view. So it's all about Azure Active Directory and leveraging those bearer tokens and the user principals to represent the user that's logged in as part of that. So that's sort of the first step, getting from the framework web part to the logic app. Now I showed you the API connections in the logic app. They already have a way to authenticate in there that we're going to continue to leverage from that point of view. But then we come to the Azure Automation. So when I come to the scripts that we have in here, so the runbooks, what identity do they run under? And this is an important piece that was the late night last night. We're still working through on how we deploy this, but there's what's called a run as account. And actually, I think I've got some slide pieces that talk a bit more about this. Yeah, so talking about a service principal, there's actually not a lot of documentation or cool infographics that I could steal. I stole this one and put the link to the blog post. You've got it in here. There's a good article in Microsoft Docs, not a lot of good pictures in there that discusses the difference between app identities, service principals, user principals, and what that all means. In a nutshell, when I register an application, which is not a person, so think of this Teams provisioning of this run as account as an application. I register that in my home tenant as an Azure AD application. When I grant roles and permissions to that application, it creates what's called a service principal. And that service principal takes the application ID and the roles that you've assigned in this particular tenant and gives it access to certain resources in Azure from there. Now, applications can be multi-tenant. You can create a service principal back to that same application in a different tenant and give it different permissions into resources in this other tenant over here as well. So really the application represents the single identity of that application. The service principal is the combination of that and some roles and permissions in a particular Azure AD tenant is the way to think about it through there. So this run as app, which gets created automatically as part of the automation account, is set up for you up in Azure AD. And there's a public private key combination that goes as part of this as well. So it creates a public key cert that it registers in Azure AD, and it creates a hidden key vault underneath your automation account, which is a secure place to keep secrets like certificates, and it puts the private key into that key vault underneath the automation account. And then what you need to do is apply roles and permissions to that application in that tenant. And what happens is when the script runs, it uses that certificate that it has in its key vault to talk to Azure AD and to say, hey, I need a bearer token for me as a service principal, not as a user, to do the things that this application's been permitted to do, and then its script can run from there. So let's have a look under the hood. I know there's a sort of mind-bending, lots of pieces going on in there, but let's kind of walk through what that looks like. So this is the auto-created account, the run as account. It's got a display name, it's got an application ID, which is also called a client ID often. They use those names interchangeably. And then down here we can see the service principal object, which is the one that has specific roles assigned to it. So let's actually find this application in my directory. So I'm just going to open up a new tab here. And I'm going to go into Azure Active Directory. So you'll find them underneath app registration. So you can manually create them. You can do a self-signed certificate and upload it and manage it yourself. And that's what we need to do when we're running locally. We need a cert on our local machine. But what I want to do here is go find that application. Sorry, I always have grief with this. I did a dry run and it worked for me, but we want that display name. Maybe it's under all applications. There we go. So what it does is it uses the name of the automation account that we created, and then it appends a unique string at the end of that, and that becomes the application ID. Now, one thing to remember is that these do expire. They have a 1-year lifespan on them, and you have to go and renew that certificate. So before April 17th, I've got to do the renewal on that. You don't have to wait to the day of. You can do it in advance, and it'll keep the old and the new cert in there. So from a transition point of view, it works well from that point of view. They don't have auto renewal of certificates yet. We do that with SSL certs and app services in Azure, which works really well there. I'm not sure if it's part of the roadmap on this side here. Let's dig into that Azure application. So I'm going to look at the API permissions. What things have been granted to this app? And by default, all it's going to do is give it access to read its own profile, which isn't very useful. What we need to do is read all the users' profiles, because we got to figure out information about people that have submitted these requests. And we need full control to all the SharePoint sites, because we're going to create new sites. We're going to update sites as part of that. So it's a pretty broad, so you have to treat the certificates pretty carefully here. They're highly privileged accounts. There's no multi-factor authentication because these are not intended to be used by people. They're supposed to be stored in a key vault securely up in the cloud and only managed from that point of view. Now, right now, when I give it this full control all, it has access to every single site, regardless of the privacy on it, across your entire SharePoint tenant, which sounds pretty scary, but it's actually what it needs for this process to work. There is a preview feature where you can lock those permissions down and say, hey, I only want to apply it to these site collections. In this use case, though, we wouldn't want that. We actually need it to have access to everything, so it can crawl all the sites and build out its sites list and do those sorts of things. So you basically grant permissions through here, and then once you've granted new permissions, you have to grant admin consent to get this green checkbox to say, yep, everything's good to go from that point of view. And now the code can use this permission to do what it needs to do. So if I come back to my actual runbooks in here, and I look at, for example, the helper runbook, let's just view that one. So here's the helper ConnectPNP Online. So ConnectPNP Online is a standard function. It's part of the PNP commandlets. We just created this helper one to kind of simplify and make it a little easier to work with. And it basically says, hey, if I'm running an Azure Automation, I need to get that run as connection and get the service principal from Azure AD that's underneath that connection. And basically what I can do then from that service principal connection, I know my client ID, or sorry, my tenant ID, my application or client ID, and the thumbprint of that certificate that's stored in my local key vault securely. Pass all that over to PNP, and PNP will say, okay, now you have a connection that has whatever rights have been granted in those API permissions. Now the rest of the script can do what it needs to do. Again, SharePoint Online. There's similar connections to connect to Azure AD, to connect to Microsoft Teams. They all use certificates. And this certificate method way of doing it is Microsoft's preferred way when you're building these kind of scripts and using PNP going forward with their new libraries. If I'm running locally, what we do is we actually store that certificate in the local certificate store, and we just put a thumbprint into a configuration to say, hey, use this configuration. So there's a few steps you need to do to create the certs and set your local machine up, and then you can run the code, and all the rest of the code runs the same as if you were in Azure Automation. So it's a nice way to debug it from that point of view. So I know we went a little deep on there, but you know, there's a fair number of moving pieces and a fair bit to figure out from that point of view. Now, how do we simplify deploying all this? Because it sounds like a lot of complexity, and how do we make your life easier from that point of view? And that's where ARM templates come in. So we've actually put up in Marketplace a listing for the Teams provisioning. It's just a contact listing right now. What we're going to be doing is moving that to an ARM template. So the work in progress that we have there. Let me just have a look here. So if I look in our local Azure DevOps, this is where we have all of our source code. We've got a number of scripts that we've been working on for deploying things out. And the out of the box doesn't get you all the way there. So we're actually building some fairly sophisticated scripts to generate the ARM template and then deploy it out. So the ARM template generator, what it does is it points at a resource group. So if we look back at this EOM sites resource group, and there's all these pieces in here, you can do an export of an ARM template right through the portal, but it's not a very useful template because it doesn't have all the parameters set up properly, and it's not baked and ready to go from that point of view. So that's what this script does, is it exports that template, but then it fixes up all the parameters. So it'll ask you things like, you know, all those configuration options for the logic app and for the variables in the Azure Automation account as part of the ARM template for deployment. And the ARM template deployer just flips that the other way. It says, take all those resources that got exported out, because not everything can get packaged into the ARM template itself. If we look at what it exports out, it creates the template itself. So this basically defines all of the resources that we need to have in there, along with all the parameters. You know, it's pretty convoluted to look at, but inside this, deeper down in here, is things like the actual logic app that we were looking at. So if I dig deeper into here, not sure how far down through it, we actually start to see that. Oh, here we go. So these are actually steps in the logic app, and you can get it into a code view in logic app to see this. You don't need to. You basically deploy the ARM template, and it deploys all those steps into the workflow for you. Sorry, hang on. Okay. But what it doesn't do is put the actual Runbook PowerShell scripts into the ARM template. So we actually extract those separately, and part of the deployer actually deploys those PowerShell scripts out as well. So the idea is when we're all done this, you know, you'll get a folder like this out of GitHub, and we'll also provide the generator and the deployer scripts. You run the deployer script, point it at your Azure subscription, and it'll basically provision all this stuff out for you. And it'll be wired and ready to go based on the parameters that you put in. The only manual steps you have to do after that, there are permissions for the run as account. We're trying to automate that. We may be able to get that part automated, but the actual API connections for the logic apps, when I was showing you that you had to come in here and do an authorize, you'll still need to do that because it requires you to go through an interactive login as part of this authorization here. So we can't script that part of it, but everything else will be baked and set to go. And then one of the things we'll be doing is adding a runbook into that list there that will actually deploy all the SharePoint bits that you need. So all these different lists and libraries will get deployed as one of those runbooks, and it'll make it very easy to deploy the whole solution out. So our end goal is to actually allow you to come to the Azure Marketplace, say, yes, I'd like this solution. It'll then ask you a bunch of questions about your Azure subscription that you're signed into, and it'll deploy all those pieces for you. So it becomes very much almost a one-click process to deploy it out. Now, that can also be leveraged, and we're doing this on a number of other projects with DevOps itself. So I mentioned that we're using Azure DevOps as our source repository for this. DevOps is a lot more than that. It's what we use for our agile sprint backlogs, and it's also something we can do with what's called pipelines through here as well. So we can have it so that when we make a change to one of these elements in here, maybe we update one of these PowerShell scripts, that DevOps sees that change and says, hey, that was checked in. I'm going to run a pipeline and actually deploy that updated code right to our dev integration, right to this Envision IT Dev Tenant. So we don't have to worry about, hey, did I actually get this updated with all the right bits? DevOps takes care of that. That's what continuous integration is all about. As check-ins happen, can be automatically deployed. In a full solution, you can actually do automated testing as part of that as well. And then you can have release pipelines that say, okay, take that solution that we've validated in our dev integration and move it into our QA environment, into our production environment, and go from there. So there's lots of options from that perspective. Look at that, 4 minutes to spare. We're getting to the wrap-up points. So a couple of highlight points here. Make sure you are using that latest version of the PNP PowerShell. There is a converter tool that Microsoft has to help you fix your scripts up if you need to. This run as service principle, it's a really important thing from an MFA, from a not using user accounts, and from a future direction from Microsoft. So, dig into those articles. The links are there. Really understand what's happening there. The ARM template packaging is hugely important to make this an easier to deploy solution. And the simplified architecture, we're getting rid of the API and bringing the web parts directly into the logic app and just doing more out of the box from that point of view. Last thing I want to touch on, we do have actually quite a few upcoming webinars. So if you're interested, we've got a whole series on forms and workflow coming up in March. Check that out. We've got a secure development and software development lifecycle. So I'm going to go deeper into some of the secure development topics I was talking about, like how you do the bearer token authentication from SharePoint framework to the logic app, for example, and things like that. And also software development lifecycle, the whole DevOps. Release pipelines, how you build a better process around your development processes, and even how do you manage multiple environments, like a dev versus a test versus a production environment. And then lastly, we've got a couple more, one on compliance and document collection with external parties, and another some interesting work we're doing, actually using Azure Automation to collect data from planner boards and then allow Power BI dashboards to use that harvested data. So check it out. Lots of different things, interesting things coming up from there. I don't think we had any Q&A through there, so I don't know if I just went over heads or answered everybody's questions or somewhere in between. But we're almost at the top of the hour there. I think we'll wrap it at that point, and want to say thank you for joining us. We'll see you next time. Thanks, everybody.